fascinating man on his own. When they set up the ghetto, which was set up officially in not right at the beginning of the war, but in November of 1940, he was very involved in help organizations. Of course, they spoke Yiddish. One of those organizations was called a Leinhilfe, a self-help organization. But the main thing that he is now known for, and that he left us as a really valuable legacy from the Warsaw Ghetto, is he formed a group as a historian and a person who valued scholarship, history, Jewish identity. He put to work what he knew best. And what he did was to gather around him a team of, we don't know exactly how many, of approximately 50 to 60 people who were kind of a variety of people who were scholars, historians, writers, poets, artists, diarists, and their job, the mandate was, I want you in whatever genre of writing that you are most familiar with to record and record and record what is happening here in the ghetto and record truthfully. And this group was called the Oinig Shabbos group. Sometimes you'll see Oneg Shabbat, which is the modern Hebrew pronunciation, but that's not quite right. These were Yiddish-speaking people, Yiddish-speaking, Polish-speaking, and they would not have called themselves probably Oneg Shabbat. It's Oinig Shabbos. And the reason it's called Oinig Shabbos is because they had regular meetings, and those regular meetings often took place on Shabbat afternoon, when one would enjoy the Shabbat, and that's the meaning of Oneg Shabbat. But of course, their enjoyment of Shabbat was a very, very different one. And they would organize, talk about logistics, talk about who wrote what was coming up. And so here as I said, I have a picture of him here. I just chose a quote, which now he was a secular Jew, not a religious one. As I said, a member of a left Zionist group, as most members of this group, although I will introduce you to one in particular, Orthodox member, but most were secular. Zionist, Marxist, at that time in this period, the place was teeming with all kinds of isms. A very, very fascinating period before the war. And of course, these groups, Marxists, socialists, communists, Zionists, Orthodox, of every stripe, Hasidic Jews, were all congregated together or locked up together in the ghetto. So I chose a quote from his, which opened up the last book that actually he left us, because he continued to work. And remember, these people were doing this literally while they're starving to death, literally while their families are being decimated. And I consider this it's one of the greatest acts of resistance. Not that well known. I think it's become much more well known now, but virtually really, really in the background for a long, long time until recently. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But here's, I thought I would take a quote where he kind of works with religious terminology, but for him it means something different. When a sofer, a scribe, sets out to copy the Torah, he must, according to religious law, take a ritual bath in order to purify himself, so he has to go to the mikveh. The scribe takes up his pen with a trembling heart, because the smallest mistake means the destruction of the whole work. So a sofer, if he makes a mistake, sometimes it can be corrected, sometimes not. It is with this feeling of fearfulness that I have begun this work, his own work of scholarship, his own work of history, that he knew in all likelihood he wouldn't be around to actually witness its publication. I have begun this work. I am writing in the hideout on the Aryan side. So what he's talking about is that after a couple of years in the ghetto, in 43, he managed to escape from the ghetto with his wife and his son Uri. And they were eventually found out, again, a long, long story, eventually given up by informers and killed, executed by the Nazis. So what happened with the Oneg Shabbos group documents were that Emanuel Ringelblum knew that time was running out, and he had a couple of everything was kept very secret. Only him and a couple of his right-hand men knew exactly who were the members of the group, because he didn't want, if anybody was captured, he didn't want them to be perhaps tortured, and then the whole organization would be exposed. And so a number of them were ordered to bury the documents, And they were buried in three separate caches. One in three separate ones. For everybody, the miracle, if I can talk about miracles, it's very difficult to say miracle, but the miracle in terms of, so I'm using this in both a secular, perhaps in a religious term, the miracle in terms of us discovering this unbelievable treasure trove of documents is that the right-hand man, the only people to survive were three from this group. Three people survived. A woman named Ruchel Auerbach, and a couple named Hirsch and Bluma Wasser. Hirsch Wasser was the assistant to Emanuel Ringelblum. He was the only one living after the war that knew where these documents, knew that these documents were buried altogether and where they were buried. So he knew exactly the address. And after the war, he implored, he got people, hard to get people to believe him, but immediately after the war, two of the caches were recovered by leading the Jewish Historical Commission of Poland to its first burial site. 10 metal boxes were recovered shortly after the war. The second portion of the archives were uncovered in December of 1950. And we know the exact address, 68 Novolipsky Street. But the difficulty, of course, was that Warsaw was completely leveled. So there were no longer any street signs, no longer any landmarks, no longer any buildings, really. So this was a difficult endeavor. Much like an archaeological expedition. And so luckily, they retrieved two of them. Here is a picture of the containers that they were in. So the first shipment, if you want to call it that, were 10 metal boxes. And the second one were these milk containers. This is a picture of when they were excavating the Warsaw Ghetto underneath that address and finding the first set of metal boxes. So what this discovery gave us, and it's impossible to really overestimate the significance of this discovery. This Oneg Shabbos group and this discovery, by the way, that third shipment, if you want to call it, the third burial of material, was never discovered. We know approximately where it was. Some say that it's underneath now where the Chinese embassy is. Good luck with that. But they've tried with sonar kind of sonar equipment, but no luck with that. But regardless of that, this discovery gave us 35,000 pages of documents that document and record a few years of Warsaw ghetto life. Warsaw ghetto life. And we're talking about um, kind of an underground press. We're talking about poetry, diaries, photographs, art, artifacts, posters, even candy wrappers. It has come to light largely in the last, I would say, maybe 10 years, really 10 to 15 years, in terms of historian, in terms of scholarship, a wonderful book written by one of the most prominent scholars of Eastern European Jewish history, specifically Holocaust history, a man named Samuel Kassow. And this is his book, Who Will Write Our History? I strongly recommend it for anyone who is interested in this story. And he produced, directed actually by Steven Spielberg's sister. Some of you may have seen it. It had a showing about a year or so ago in a theater here in Toronto. It's not regularly shown, but it's a documentary called Who Will Write Our History? And so it's gained a little bit of more notoriety, which of course it deserves. So what does this have to do with our topic tonight? I think it's very important to kind of lay the groundwork, the historical groundwork for this. The writings that I am going to talk about, try and talk about, were buried along with this Oinig Shabbos group material. And so that's why we have that, and that's why I can, deliver a lecture on it tonight, is because of the Oinig Shabbos group and the preservation of these documents. Now, he was not a formal card-carrying member of this group. So the question is, how did his sermons get in to be part of this group? But before I talk about that, let me give you just a little bit of background to this, not rabbi technically, but a rebbe. So there is a difference between a rebbe and a rabbi. That is, he was not the community rabbi of a city or a small city or a village, or a rabbi of a synagogue, let's say, but he was a leader of a small Hasidic sect called the Piasetzner. So often Hasidic rebbes are named after the particular area that they operated in, or where their center was. One of the most perhaps famous ones, one of the largest groups that some of you may be familiar with is Chabad. So Chabad is not formally their name, but it was Lubavitch, which these are names of towns either in Ukraine or Russia or Belarus. So Piaseczno, it was a little town very close to Warsaw, maybe a half hour. I mean, now it's maybe a 20-minute drive. But he was named, in terms of his Hasidic community, the Piasetzner Rebbe, as the leader of this community. A very unusual man. He was, as you see there, born in 1889. And of course, that second date of his death rings loud. He did not survive the war, clearly. And he was executed most likely in a camp called Tronitsky, which was a transit camp guarded by concentration camp guards. And there was a massacre there in November of 1943 that killed 43,000 Jewish prisoners. They didn't even make it to a concentration camp. And most likely, we're not 100% sure, but there are some surviving kind of secondary witnesses. Most likely was executed, killed after the war. Now, he was a musician. He was a very, very beloved rabbi by his community. And even perhaps more importantly, he had gained already, even though he was the leader of a relatively very small community in terms of Hasidic communities, he was he started a rabbinical seminary, a yeshiva, and it actually was the second largest yeshiva in Poland, next to perhaps one of the, maybe the largest, if not, maybe one of the largest, if not the largest Hasidic group called Gur. And the reason it was the second largest, and by the way, when we say large, even the very, very most prominent yeshivot, the rabbinical seminaries, some of you may have heard, like Volozhin, or these never really, it's not like now in perhaps a place like Lakewood where you have thousands of students. Large means hundreds. And so if you had 300 students, that was a very, very large rabbinical seminary. And so he had the second largest one because, and it tells us something about him, because of his pedagogical fame. So he was very well known for being very adept at as a pedagogue, and applying these warm, what we would call warm, welcoming pedagogical methods to his students. And so had gained quite a reputation that attracted many students to his yeshiva. And before the war, he only published one sefer, or one book before the war, which was a book of really Chovat HaTalmidim, the obligations of the students, which was a book about pedagogy and about teacher-student relationship. Before I get to the next slide, when the war started in September, at least when the Germans invaded Poland and bombarded Poland from the air in September of 1939, this Rebbe, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, by the way, he was a descendant of a very long line of very, very prominent major Hasidic Rebbes, going back to a man, a very famous Rebbe called the Chose of Lublin, the seer of Lublin. Some of you might be familiar, if you're familiar with the history of Hasidut. In any event, when the war started, immediately this man's family was totally decimated. So unfortunately, his sister-in-law was visiting at the time to Poland. I'm going to get to that part of his family in a few minutes. And during the bombing, there was a congregation of the family without the Rebbe. The Rebbe wasn't with them at the time. His son, there was a bomb where they were gathered. His son was seriously injured. His daughter-in-law was killed. His sister-in-law was killed. His mother died immediately after that. His son kind of lingered with very serious injuries and died on Sukkot of that year. So we're talking in the fall of 1939. So this is a man who begins the war with his family totally decimated. His only son, he had two children, another daughter who we don't know much about, except that she was deported as well. He mentions her a few times, and her loss, and that he can no longer find her. And so we know that she was deported and killed as well. So what he decided to do was to give sermons, to give what we call drashot. Again, in his language, would have been drushes, every Shabbat that he could. And so he gave these drashot, and this is really, really important, and I'll explain the importance of this in a few minutes. But we know the exact dates of these drashot. That is, from the time that the Germans invaded Poland, from the time that he suffered this this terrible loss in the fall of 1939, to the summer, meaning to July of 1942, is when the sermons end. And that's when, about a week before, what they call the Great Deportations begin, meaning when the Warsaw Ghetto, when the Germans, the Nazis, decided to deport everyone in the Warsaw Ghetto to the killing fields, to the concentration camps where they were murdered. And for obvious reasons, the drashot, the sermons, end there. He decided to keep on writing. So he kept on, so he transcribed these sermons. Sermons were certainly given in Yiddish. This is the protocol. This is the custom of all these Hasidic Rebbes would, or even non-Hasidic Rebbes, would give their talks or their sermons in Yiddish. That was the lingua franca of the people, but always write them down, virtually always write them down, or others would record them in Hebrew. So when he transcribed the sermons would have been given in Yiddish. They would have been transcribed in Hebrew, and he preserved them, and he kept on working on them all through the war, all through the years, not through the entire war, obviously. And even after he stopped giving these sermons, we know he kept on working on them and editing them and going back to sermons that he gave earlier and appending notes to them and changing his mind. So, and we can date every single one of these sermons. We know, for instance, he gave this sermon on Passover of 1942, this sermon in January 15th of 1940. So they're extremely valuable from that point of view, from a historical point of view, but they're very, very valuable from the content point of view. And I have to say, and this comes as a shock to some people, it's not just that this is something we have and something valuable, and we have lots of this, lots of other writings. Actually, we do not. We do not have one other single work written. What I mean here is written contemporaneously with what's going on by someone who is living day to day in the thick of it, by an Orthodox, what I'm talking about here is drashot, sermons, by an Orthodox rabbi. We have no other such artifact. Okay. Some of you might ask me maybe during question period, there are some others that we have that people have asked me about, but they're not comparable and don't have these qualities. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't see people, and I don't know if anybody has any questions, but if anybody does, I'm happy to answer them. It's sometimes
So
it's not.
so far, people have not raised their hands
Okay.
nor sent me a message in the chat. So I think we're
Okay.
good for now.
All right. So So again, I'll just repeat that. Please stop me at any point if something's not clear or there's something I've left out in the details, because there's lots of rich material here behind every one of these slides, and of course, time constraints. I can't tell you everything, but I'm trying to convey as best as I possibly can the importance and the value of this, and as a work of resistance. This, for me, is like everything else in this Oinig Shabbos treasure of documents, a work of resistance as powerful as the resistance that everyone else knows, that has been the one that this kind has played, not just second fiddle, but has been totally ignored pretty well, which is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And perhaps we can talk about that and discuss why. I have my own theories about that. But I think this should be, and I'm thankful for being given the opportunity to give these kinds of lectures, not because I need this to build up my CV, but because I view this seriously as almost, I would say, a religious obligation, to make sure that this is known far and wide. So let me go to the next slide and talk about how did Rabbi Shapira's sermons end up along with this collection known as the Oinig Shabbos group. So the one member of the group that was very Orthodox was a man, there's his picture known, his name was Rabbi Shimon Huberbrand. He actually was also a very, very scholarly rabbi, steeped in rabbinic literature. So that is, he was both a historian, but also an expert in something that most of the other people in the group, including Emmanuel, would not have known, which is the rabbinic tradition. Of course, that goes without saying, applies even more so, I would say, to the Hasidic Rebbe, to Rabbi Shapira. And he actually authored a book, which we now have because of the Oinig Shabbos treasure, called Kiddush Hashem. And there's the book. You can actually get it. I think it might be available even on Amazon. Kiddush Hashem, Jewish Religious and Cultural Life in Poland During the Holocaust. He made it his mission to record how religious people responded to the times of crisis, and how they performed what we would call Kiddush Hashem, acts of martyrdom, if you want to call it that. I really don't like that term that much because it has a lot of Christian connotations, but let's call it that. And so that deserves another lecture altogether. He was a card-carrying member of the collective, and he happened to be a very close relative of Rabbi Shapira. So the general consensus until now was that somehow Rabbi Shapira knew, not somehow, he most certainly knew about the Oinig Shabbos group because of his involvement also in these help organizations, in food kitchens. And he most certainly knew of his cousin, actually he's closer than that, but his Rabbi Shimon Huberbrand. And so that was the connection, the link. However, that's been brought into question most recently because he died, or he was deported, in all likelihood, before Rabbi Shapira finished his work on the manuscript. So we're still a bit in the dark about how it got there, but irrespective of how it got there, it is there, and we have it. And I wanted to just show you something already in the work. So I want to slowly get into what we call the kishkis of this work, but something that puts together Rabbi Huberbrand and Rabbi Shapira from their works. So here you have from his book, we have evidence, we have a report from him that he actually visited with Rabbi Shapira, who still had a community on Purim in the Warsaw Ghetto, and still was able to celebrate Purim, limited, of course, far more limited than we are. I guess we need to take everything in perspective. We're in the middle of a crisis, but I still would not dare to compare it to the predicament that Rabbi Shapira or Rabbi Huberbrand were in. Um, so this is what he says about a visit on Purim. In that book, the Rebbe, meaning Rabbi Shapira, said words of Torah, including many words of strengthening and encouragement. Various zmiros were sung, meaning songs from the liturgy, songs from standard kind of Hebrew prayer songs. When the gathering concluded, the traditional dance with one person standing behind the other began. During the dance, the Rebbe wept profusely. And then correlating to that, here is what I've taken out of his sermons. This sermon, exactly on Purim, we know when it was given. We know it was given in March of 1942. The last Purim that is recorded in the sermons, and it certainly goes together with what Rabbi Huberbrand reported. And he talks about virtually every single one of the sermons, and that's what makes them important in terms of the title of today's lecture, confronting a crisis. I think time of adversity probably really understates the circumstances that we're talking about here. This is far more than adversity. This is the world is literally ending, right? The world is literally ending, and it did end for virtually everyone in the Warsaw Ghetto, and for a vast majority of Eastern European Jews. So we're talking about much more than adversity. And this is what he said that correlates exactly with Rabbi Huberbrand's description. And what I want to preface when I talk about what he says in these sermons is virtually every sermon deals with suffering, pain, hunger, not being able to learn Torah, not being able to teach Torah, not being able to observe Sabbath. So these are all, of course, cardinal, events, cardinal activities in this man's life. They mean as much to him as eating his next meal. And so virtually every sermon, and as you can imagine, things are getting worse and worse and worse as we go along. It's never getting better. So virtually every sermon deals with the problem of how do people of faith continue to keep their faith? How do people of faith respond with faith? How do people who can no longer study Torah or keep Sabbath or go to synagogue, how do they express themselves? And even importantly, how does he himself continue to do what he feels he's there to do, which is to preserve his community in terms of its faith, in terms of shoring it up, in terms of giving it what we call chizuk, to reinforce them week after week, until the point where he knows that there's no longer really a future. So there are statements about that are kind of self-reflective about what the leader's role is when dealing with this kind of a crisis. And this is what he says on, but he never, and this is interesting, he never really refers specifically to events that are occurring. Like he won't say, you know what, today the Nazis ordered the deportations, or today the Nazis, promulgated a decree that we can no longer congregate for a prayer. He never even mentions the word Nazis. Okay. Um, you know, in each sermon what he's talking about. You know the pain he's talking about. You know when he says we can no longer pray. You know what he's talking about. But I think what he's trying to do, the reason he does that, and he does mention Amalek, which is a stand-in. You know that that means the Nazis, right? Amalek, which is the kind of enemy of Israel in the Bible that is evil incarnate, one could say. The enemy that is more evil than any other enemy, and that kind of transcends all reasons that one could be an enemy of Israel. And those are the ones that we are commanded biblically to remember, right? Zachor, and not to forget, lo tishkach. So when he says Amalek, the references to Amalek in the sermons are certainly to the Nazis. But he intentionally doesn't want to mention their name, with good reason. Why should he dirty, I think, his sermons with their name? We know what he's talking about. And also, more importantly, he knows that he's writing these sermons for posterity. And so he does not want to historically limit it. He wants it to be a book that is relevant for all crises in the future, not just for the crisis he's living in. He wants this to be some kind of book that speaks to people, to keep a record, yes, of his struggle and of the people's struggle in the ghetto. So that was very important, not to forget that, and to somehow to lend them another book in the rabbinic tradition that allows us a window into how a man of faith preserved his faith, or perhaps transformed his faith somewhat. And this is what he says. So he talks about pain on Purim. When pain reaches a point where he can no longer, meaning a person, can no longer surround and contain it within himself, meaning pain, the normal the normal etiquette is to keep it within yourself until it gets to a point where you can no longer keep it hidden, and then you're forced to reveal it in words, in crying, or with screams. During the dance, as Huberbrand said, the Rebbe wept profusely, talking about the same thing from different perspectives. So let me get to the actual manuscript. I don't want to go on too long. I know, and I'm told, I'm teaching now remotely at university, that my students, people get Zoom fatigue. So I don't want to go on too long, but I'm going to try and introduce a few more things. Rabbi, if you're still around, what would you say? Another 15 minutes, let's say? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that's another 15 minutes, and then we can certainly stop for questions. And if people have questions, please remember to raise your hand or to type it into the chat, and be happy to let Professor Diamond know.
Yeah, that would be great. So here's an actual script. So we have the manuscript in his original handwriting, and it has a letter attached to it. So he knew, in all probability, that he was not going to be around to see his manuscript published. And this is what he says, and this is a translation of this script. As you can see, it's very, very difficult to make out. So some of you, I'm sure, know Hebrew. And this is extremely difficult to make out. This is one of the easier folios. And I'll get to that in a minute. But this is what he says. I have the honor of requesting the esteemed individual or institution that finds my enclosed writings. So he's addressing it to whoever finds these, and now we know how they were found. There were all kinds of legends, by the way, that surrounded the finding of this, but we now know how they were found. So there were other writings that he still worked on. I mean, it's quite incredible to me that the man is, after the loss of his family, the loss of his whole community, starvation, can still work on not just the sermons, but other works of Torah. That's what these are, what they called Haksharat Avrichim, Mavo Hasharim, and the entrance to the gates. Tzav v'zeruz, meaning a kind of a document that demanding attention. And then this is important. This is what the sermons are called. Torah insights on the weekly readings from the years 5700, 5701, 5702. Those are the Hebrew words, roughly speaking, from 1939 to 1942. To please exert themselves, send them to the land of Israel to the following address. Now, this is very, very interesting. Rabbi Yeshaya Shapira, his brother, Tel Aviv, Palestine. Please also send the enclosed letter. And so there was another letter that was more confidential. This was the external letter, written, addressed to whoever would find them. When the Blessed One will show mercy and I and the remaining Jews survive the war, please return. So if I do survive, return them to me, right? The remnant, and may God have mercy upon us, the remnant of Israel in every place, rescue us. So he's still hoping that God will save them. And so that's the external letter. And this is the letter that he wrote to his brother. I ask of you, my beloved brother and dear ones, that once God helps, and the essays, Chidushe Torah, this is what he called it, which is not the way it has been known for those who have known it since for the last, they were first published in 1960. I'll get to that in a moment. The years of rage, Shnot Haza'am, 5700, again, those years, you designed to make an effort to publish them, either collectively or singly as your judgment sees fit. The words of your loving friend and brother who yearns for you, he had not seen him for a long time. In fact, when this was discovered, his brother unfortunately had died. His brother had unfortunately died of actually a heart attack in Israel, Palestine, before the war ended, and he didn't even live to know that. And shattered with his own torments, who yearns for you, who is broken and shattered with his own torments and the torments of all the Jewish people. He is shattered, which are as deep as the abyss and as high as the heavens, who anticipates God's salvation, keheref ayin, in the blink of an eye, kolonimus. And then his request is that the printing of his writings bear his personal plea that each and every Jew study my works. Ani mitchanein lifnei kol echad miYisrael sheyilmad b'sifri. That in my work, or my works, right, he implores them. Now, this is interesting. I just, on the side here, I've been involved in Holocaust literature for a long, long time. And this really echoes sentiments of many people who have written about the Holocaust, survivors. This idea that when I write this as a survivor, my memoir, you, audience, are obligated to read it. Now, this isn't a self-promotion, right? This isn't, like an editor's ploy, to a book publisher's ploy to sell books. This is an honestly felt, opinion about the intensity of their work, the value, here in his case, the religious value of this work. Right. And so I just have a few quotes here that kind of capture the same idea. He echoes the exact same sentiment. This is Gustava Jarecka, who wrote, also was part of the Oynik Shabbos, and wrote a report These notes are driven by an instinct, a desire to leave a mark, by despair close to crying. The record should be hurled like a stone under the wheel of history in order to stop it. What she means is that we can't stop it now, but this is a record. This Oinik Shabbos group, what she is writing, is meant to be looked at, to be read, so that it can stop the wheel of history, the wheel of history that is simply hurtling towards total catastrophe. Primo Levi, I would say the greatest writer by a survivor of his experiences and responses to the Holocaust altogether, who was an Italian Jew, a secular, largely assimilated Italian Jew, an atheist. He introduces his work with a curse, drawing on, it's interesting how some of these seculars, just like I told you about Emanuel Ringelblum, draw on the tradition, even though Primo Levi, during the war, before the war, and after the war, was a committed atheist, never changed that opinion, but he draws on the religious tradition and in a way subverts it, but he uses this as an introduction to his words, his great work, which really in Italian is called If This Is a Man, but it was published in English as Survival in Auschwitz. I commend these words to you. Carve them in your hearts, at home in the street, going to bed, rising. So repeat them to your children. So some of you may recognize this. This is loosely taken from the Shema. V'shinantem levanecha, v'shachbecha uvkumecha, when you go to sleep, when you get up. Or may your houses fall apart. May illness impede you. May your children turn their faces from you. Very, very strong words. Again, this is not a ploy to sell books. This is the same feeling expressed by the Rebbe, the same feelings expressed by a member of the Oinik Shabbos group, and really the same feeling expressed by Elie Wiesel in his Nobel Prize lecture in 1986. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, not the prize for literature. Each one of us felt compelled to record every story, every encounter. Each one of us felt compelled to bear witness. Such were the wishes of the dying, the testament of the dead. Since the so-called civilized world had no use for their lives, then let it be inhabited by their deaths. Quite powerful, but that's exactly the sentiment expressed here. The world doesn't care about my life or the lives of my community. Let it be inhabited by my sermons. Let it be inhabited by the records of the Oinik Shabbos group. Let it be inhabited by my experience in Auschwitz. That's exactly, and Elie Wiesel, in his powerful way, let it be inhabited by our deaths. And I'm going to tell you about our deaths. Claude Lanzmann, let me skip that for the moment because I want to get to his brother. So who was his brother? Quite fascinating and quite rare for a Hasidic family. They called him, he actually emigrated, made Aliyah very early, before 1920, a committed Zionist from a very strong Hasidic family. Some of you who are familiar with ultra-Orthodox Judaism in Eastern Europe is largely made up, the vast majority of really, I would call anti-Zionist, anti the idea of political Zionism, of the establishment of a state, particularly a secular state. And yet you did have Orthodox rabbis, particularly maybe the most famous, Rabbi Kook, the first pre-established State of Israel chief Ashkenazic rabbi, Rabbi Avram Isaac Kook, who made Aliyah from Eastern Europe in 1900, forget the exact date. So you did have, but they were probably the exceptions that prove the rule. They called him because of that, because it was so unusual, Admor. Admor is a a contraction of words that mean that refer to a leader, a Hasidic Adonenu Morenu, meaning our master, our teacher, and that's what is a title of a Hasidic master. Ha'admor ha'chalutz. Chalutz are Zionist pioneers who emigrated to Israel, and they called him the Hasidic master, the Chalutz, because there weren't many. He actually went on to be a founder of Poel Mizrahi, a kind of more left socialist Orthodox group, actually established a bank, and then ended up giving it all up and becoming a farmer. And so very worthy of another kind of book himself. I don't think anybody has actually written, I haven't seen yet a book, but certainly worthy of a book. But that's who he addressed his work to. So quite fascinating. I want to get to this word za'am. So the work, when it was discovered, the manuscript, at least the photocopy of the manuscript, was sent to Israel. So that manuscript, some of you, I didn't mention this yet, but it's important to state, actually remains housed in Poland in the building called the Jewish Historical Institute, the same building that existed before the war, that was called that same thing, that Emanuel Ringelblum himself had worked in before the war. And so it continues to be an institute dedicated to Jewish life in Poland, primarily, of course, because there's not that much Jewish life after the war. It's gotten a little bit of a rejuvenation, but clearly never like it would have been before the war. Some of you might know the Nazis. If you want to talk about the Nazis failing and the Nazis losing the war, in fact, they did not lose the war in Poland. What I mean is the war against the Jews. The genocide against the Jews in Poland was pretty well a success. The numbers speak for themselves. People need to remember this. 3 million approximately before the war, approximately 200 to 250,000 remaining after the war. So Polish Jewry was completely wiped out. So we have to remember this, that, you know, people talk about survivors, and of course that's important, but it's also important to remember the devastation. And so he actually, if you recall, he called it simply a non-title. It was a non-title. He just called it the Chidushei Torah, which means novel teachings from the years of rage, just kind of descriptive, not like the other works that had kind of Hebrew names, which is interesting. When the Hasidim, so because his brother left a family, so that family continues that Hasidic community until this day. So I suppose it would be his grandnephew or his great-grandnephew that continues to be a kind of lead that community. It's not really a community anymore, but whoever wants to join it in Israel, I believe it's in Beit Shemesh. You know, when it got to that community through that family in Israel, they published it and they gave it their own name. And they called it the Eish Kodesh. So any of you who were familiar with this before this lecture may have known it as Eish Kodesh, the holy fire or the sacred fire, but that's not what he called it. So they, I suppose, wanted to give it like a name, make it, you know, for publishing purposes, but that's not what he gave it. He gave it a kind of a non-title, and the word is za'am, rage. So I'm just going to end with what that term means and what it meant for him. Za'am is a word that's used a number of times throughout the Bible and throughout rabbinic literature. And I have two sources here in the Bible. One from Ezekiel, You could read it in Hebrew, but for those that don't, I sought a man, God seeks a man to repair the wall or stand in the breach, but I found none. I have therefore poured out my indignation. I will consume them with the fire of my rage, za'am. So this captures, I think, one sense of why he uses the word za'am, is that God, in this case, in Ezekiel, says the people have sinned and I am going to destroy them. But I need, if there is a man who will stand in the breach and try and advocate for them, then I will hold myself back. And so he finds none at that time. And so I think that's the sense. That is, he feels he himself will be that man. If God is responsible for this, and surely in the worldview of a Hasidic Rebbe, nothing is unrelated to God, then I will stand in the breach. That is my job. And that's the way the sermons should be looked at, both as addressed to his community, but also addressed to God. These sermons are a type of what I guess I would call a firewall that he intended to be placed between God and the people. That's one sense. The other sense, I think that he slowly started to realize, is this sense from Lamentations. In his raging anger, and this was about the destruction of the temple, the first temple. In his raging anger, meaning God's, Za'am, he spurned priest and king alike, meaning the second sense is indiscriminate. Devastation that is indiscriminate. That is, if it's punishment, then it really makes no sense because it's taking sinners and innocent alike. It's destroying everything in its wake. So these two senses, I think, are the senses that are the reason he chose the word Za'am. So I think I'll stop there. And I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions that you might have. So hopefully there are some comments. They don't have to be questions.
Professor, if I can suggest that you stop the share so that we can bring everybody's
there you go.
back.
Okay?
And then that way, if people have questions, there's not that many of us. So if somebody would like to ask a question, please unmute your microphone and feel free to do so. Just let us know who you are. Either people don't have questions or they can't figure out how to unmute their microphone.
I totally empathize. It's okay.
What are the types of questions that you would get when you present this lecture?
I mean, they're very, they're really interested on how this man preserved his faith, what his community thought, what his relationship with his community was, what like, and I haven't, like, I gave a few snippets of the actual sermons, which I plan on doing next week, and that perhaps might evoke some further questions. And often, I think the main question that I've had, and I've given various forms of lectures, is, well, what's the answer? What's the answer? How does he? And so what I want to say right away, and hopefully this will come out even clearer the next time we meet, is this is not a book, a collection about answers. This is really not about answers. What is important about this, and what makes this more important to me, I have really read widely. Take it from me. I've read very widely Holocaust literature, especially Orthodox in the rabbinic tradition. And people are trying to give answers. This is not. This is an authentic record of a man struggling in real time and responding in real time from week to week with a deteriorating situation that is literally shattering everything he thought he knew in terms of how to respond to a crisis such as this in the rabbinic tradition. And so I don't look for answers anymore. If somebody starts off with that, then I now at this point in my life, I immediately abandon it. So that's I suppose a question that arises a lot. But he's not giving us an answer. He's not he's not telling us what we should do, perhaps. But what I think is important is to really see and observe through his legacy how, right? And then take from that what you can, right? Not an answer, not a resolution, because I don't think there will ever be a resolution to this question that the years 1939 to 1945 left us with. But this collection of drashot certainly is, I would say, almost a sacred, not almost, a sacred obligation for us to include in the, I would say, rabbinic canon in terms of responses to catastrophe.
There are a couple questions that popped up on the chat.
Sure.
One is from someone whose phone died a little bit and just wants to clarify if the book is based on the sermon that you were talking about or the letters or both.
Okay, maybe I wasn't clear. So the letter that I talked about was a letter attached to the manuscript, right? So it formed when that letter and manuscript, when the copy of it, remember we're talking about a copy that went to Israel and to the family. They published both the letter at the beginning of what became a book and the sermons. So the excerpts that I read from are excerpts like the Purim excerpt or the letter are from the book that was published. That is part of the manuscript that was buried. So the letter is not really a letter that's separate. The letter is a letter addressed to his brother that he never saw, that he probably knew he would never see again, that was attached to the manuscript. So I hope that makes it a bit clearer.
Okay. Another question is, how large was his community in the ghetto, and how do you measure his influence?
So not very large. We're not talking about, like I said, a very large community in Piaseczno itself before the war. We're talking probably hundreds, rather than thousands. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, it's hard to determine the audience that was there during the sermons. It couldn't been like a crowd that would fill Bethsaida. Certainly not by any stretch of the imagination. We're probably talking about maybe dozens, if, right? Simply because of the constraints, because of the limitations. So the community was not large. As I said, he was, his influence before the war was much larger than his actual day job, if you can call it that, as a Hasidic Rebbe, because of the rabbinic seminary that he led that attracted students from all over and from all different kinds of Hasidic communities. And his influence after the war, his influence is becoming greater and greater, particularly since when it was originally published, and we're talking about only in 1960. So the original Hebrew work that was published by the family or the members of that Hasidic community that were left in Israel, that had very little distribution. didn't get really, but slowly word got out. Word got out. And it has been gaining more and more to the point that now there are all kinds of, there are actually communities that have grown up. There, I know there's a synagogue in New York called the Eish Kodesh Synagogue that is kind of dedicated to his works. There are all kinds of groups around the world that study. So his influence has grown deservedly. I think that it's still, and the Oinic Shabbos group in general, need to be known a lot more than it is. But in a final answer to your question, it really hit, if I can, we're not talking here about a blockbuster, but it really hit a more wider audience with a man named Nehemiah Polin, a scholar, who actually did his PhD in the 80s under Elie Wiesel. So some of you might know Elie Wiesel had actually a professorship at Boston University. And one of his graduate students was this guy named Nehemiah Polin. And he put out really the first English work that was a digest thematically on the sermons, where he kind of gave a little introduction, biography, and then kind of a thematic overview of the work. And it's called Sacred Fire, the Teachings of Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira by Nehemiah Polin, P-O-L-E-N. So since that work came out, it's gained more and more exposure. But again, like I said, I wouldn't call it anywhere near blockbuster. It started off as a PhD thesis. It ended up being published, but it made its way at least into the English-speaking world. And so since then, it's gained more and more. Hopefully, it will keep on gaining more interest and exposure.
Any final questions? All right. Thank you, Professor. I just want to remind everyone that we will be back.
I think I see Ruth is a hand up. Was that? I think I saw her hand
up.
So you'd have to unmute yourself. Yeah, I think.
If you look at the bottom left toolbar, there should be a microphone icon. If you press that.
Because we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
How come it's housed in Poland?
That's a question that a lot of people ask me too. So it's housed in Poland. That's where it was found. I can tell you that they feel that they have a right to it. It's very well taken care of. I actually was there. Next week, I'll show you some slides of the actual manuscript. I actually, they took out the manuscript. I was there as part of a group that had a little conference. Some of you, if you visited Poland, there's an unbelievable multi-million-dollar museum now called Polin in Warsaw. And so the Jewish Historical Archives have it. It's very, very well preserved. I've met the people. Very fascinating. Sorry?
No. Okay, now I understand why it's in Poland.
Yeah. But it's very well taken care of. And largely, actually all non-Jewish scholars of Jewish history, really fascinating, and very, very lovely people who are really, really, really dedicated to keeping this preserved and alive. So that's why they're there. Yeah.
Last call for questions.
I think Ruth has one more. So yeah, you'd have to unmute again.
Unmute again, Ruth.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a comment. Thank you very much, Professor Diamond. I learned a great deal with a very difficult topic, but I learned a great deal, and I thank you very much for your scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. Hope to see you next week.
You will.
Thanks, William.
Okay. So we will be back next week, same bat channel, same bat time, 7:30 on the Zoom. If you want to, if you forget how to get there, you can always get there through our website or check your email for the login information that was probably sent to you. For all the other activities and opportunities to engage with Bethzetic, be sure to check our website, www.beth-zetic.org. I want to wish everyone a pleasant evening and a wonderful rest of the week.
Same
Thank
here.
you again, Professor, and we'll see you next week.
Rabbi, will you stop the recording, or?
Yeah, I'll stop automatically when I end the.
And then will I get the record, or you can send me the recording?
You can send you the recording, sure.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Rabbi. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. That's one.